Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to Deutsches Haus, which has now moved back into its fabulous, newly renovated premises. A very warm welcome also to our new, or maybe not so new, German Consul General, Britta Wagner, who is here tonight. We're very pleased. Thank you for coming. And of course, we are super thrilled and happy to be presenting this event together with the American Council on Germany on Berlin Now, the City After the Wall, a conversation between wonderful Peter Schneider and our esteemed Professor Ulrich Baer from the German department to you tonight. Perhaps last weekend, you read the New York Times and noticed, as I did, a story on the disappearance of a part of the Berlin Wall that had been on 53rd Street for a very long time. I previously worked in Midtown, and that part was very known to me. And as I am from Berlin, I always like to go there and sit there, and I felt just at home sitting in front of the piece of the Berlin Wall, enjoying my lunch or coffee. And so I read this, and I thought, that is such an amazing story now that we're approaching the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, that lo and behold, the wall can also just disappear overnight and nobody knew what happened. But I think that kind of story only happens in New York. It did not happen in Germany. Things are more seriously in Germany. So the wall was up for much longer. But we are still very happy that it's gone there too. And actually this event is the beginning of a series of events which we'll be presenting at Deutsches Haus to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall and to honor an amazing city that has gone a really completely unbelievable transformation in the last quarter century. Oh my God, quarter century makes me feel very old, I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you for coming. Please come back to our other events, and please let me thank a bunch of people without whom we would not be sitting here tonight. First of all, our wonderful partners, the American Council on Germany, especially Bill Drozdyak and Johanna Gregory and Helena Finn, the good folks from Farrar, Straus and Giroux, the amazing publisher, and please buy the book, which will be provided courtesy of Greenlight Bookstore after the event, and Peter has generously agreed to sign your copy. Please, after the event, have a glass of wine, buy a book, and get Peter to sign it. And before Bill Drozdyak will introduce Peter, I will introduce Ulrich Baer. Ulrich Baer is a professor of German and comparative literature at NYU and was appointed Vice Provost for Faculty Arts, Humanities, and Diversity in 2012. From 2007 until 2011, he was Vice Provost for Globalization and Multicultural Affairs, overseeing NYU's network of global academic sites around the world, including, of course, our NYU Berlin campus, which he's very qualified to do because he is originally from Berlin, so there. In addition to several of NYU's multicultural institutes and centers. A widely published author, editor, and translator, he's an expert on modern poetry, literary theory, and photography, and has published extensively on poetry, photography, and issues in contemporary art and culture. He's the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, NYU's Golden Dozen Teaching Award, a Getty Research Fellowship, and an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship. Among his books are Hannah Arendt Zwischen den Disziplinen, The Rilke-Alphabet, Beggar's Chicken, Stories from Shanghai, Rainer Maria Rilke, Letters on Life, The Claims of Literature, a Shoshana Fellman reader, Spectral Evidence, The Photography of Trauma, the anthology 100 Stories, New York Writers After September 11, and Remnants of Song, Trauma, and the Experience of Modernity in Charles Baudelaire and Paul Celan. So he's very well qualified to run this event. And Before I hand over to Bill, I'd also like to thank my wonderful staff, student workers, and interns, equally important for making these kinds of events happen. And if this event makes you also curious about the German language, you know you can learn German here. And with our new slogan, learn German if you dare. So, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists and Bill.
Thank you very much, Julian. And as president of the American Council on Germany, I'm delighted to be here, and I commend you and Deutsches Haus for what you are doing with this series to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce my dear friend and tennis partner, Peter Schneider, who will discuss his book about Berlin now. Peter and I go back more than 20 years when I was a correspondent for the Washington Post covering Germany and Berlin. And I have learned so much from him about Germany, transatlantic relations, and in particular the city of Berlin and what makes it such a magical place. And when you buy the book and read it, you will see why this is such a captivating capital that has attracted so many young people, has become a mecca for music and culture, and really has I think, pointed the way toward a new era for Germany and indeed for the rest of Europe. You know Peter's background. He studied in Freiburg and Munich at the university, but he's really known for as the person in Germany who really embodies the spirit of 1968. He was very active in those protests, and for those of us of the baby boomer generation born between 1945 and 55, he has really captured all along the course of his career the zeitgeist in Germany, and also during his time here teaching in the United States, the differences and the similarities between our two cultures. He foreshadowed in some respects the fall of the wall in his book Der Mauerspringer, The Wall Jumper, and several other books along the way, Edward's Homecoming, that showed the differences between East and West, and indeed East and West Berlin. I remember when I was covering the fall of the wall 25 years ago, and I showed up there. I was then foreign editor of the Washington Post. I'd come back to Berlin when I was then traveling in Asia, and Ben Bradley, my editor, he said, get to Berlin as quickly as possible. They're streaming across the wall. So I showed up the next day with jet lag, had contacted Peter, and everybody, of course, was delirious with joy, wondering what this was going to lead to. My immediate challenge was to figure out where these East Berliners were going to go. And I said, what do you think? And he said, go to the 6th floor of KaDeWe. And sure enough, with their little amounts of hard West German currency, they were there. And believe me, that yielded a terrific story for my newspaper, because I was confronted then with the images of about a couple of dozen young East Germans, East Berliners, who were standing in front of a big mountain of oranges. And they were in tears, and they were saying in German, they lied to us, they lied. And I came away from that particular day on November 9th, 1989, with the conviction that they would, the East Germans would not stop at anything less than unity, reunification of the two Germanys. And it was driven by the desire to have Western living standards. And as I said, Peter has been my guide, and he will be your guide if you read his book about the new spirit that infuses Berlin. So enjoy the conversation. Peter, Ulrich, I look forward to the dialogue.
So it's always good to have a tennis partner introducing you, because these are the guys who really know you. So When did we meet last time? I think it's 2 years. It feels like family. And no matter how heavy my accent may be, you're bound to understand it because you have the same, many of you. This book on Berlin is probably the last one. I did so many books on Berlin, I have to find another city now. But when I met my American publisher here, I told him what I had written in the last 10 years, and he never even cared to translate it. And but he wanted to know what was it, and so I would go through any book I had written so far, and he was, you know this American politeness. You know this American politeness? It doesn't mean so much, but it's much nicer than brutal German honesty. So my publisher was always nodding and saying, very interesting, Peter, we would like to see this. And I said, after a while, I know you guys. You don't give a shit on what I have told you about. So what would you like to read from the author Peter Schneider? And it came like a pistol shot. He said, no, 3 of them, a new book on Berlin. And that's how this book came about. And I decided, in order to write an interesting new book on Berlin, I had to pretend that I don't know my own city, which was a good concept. Because as a matter of fact, after '89, this is not the city I know. Anyway, so I decided I had to do a total new research, and that's what I did. And that's what you might or don't want to read. That's what the book is about. And interestingly, Berlin is not exactly a very German city. That's why people like me like it so much. And I found out most non-Germans like it for the same good reason. It is not a typical German town. It's something special, something, it's an oasis, it's an island, a special entity. And when you ask people, so what actually do you like about Berlin? They would, of course, say, because Berlin is just so beautiful. And I say, no, Berlin is not beautiful. This is not it. Tell me, what do you like about Berlin? Now, I'm in the middle of my first chapter, and I will tell you why young people like Berlin from all over the world. And they go there because Berlin is still, we don't know how long, it's still very cheap. Cheaper than any other capital in Europe, including Prague. The trains run the whole night. Even at 4 in the morning, you get to any club you want. And in the clubs themselves, they start at Friday or Saturday midnight. This is entrance time. This is when you only can get in at midnight. You get a stamp on the back of your hand. The stamp is valid until Tuesday afternoon. You will ask me, what does it mean? Well, it means that you stay until Tuesday afternoon. You are allowed to leave it, but you can come back. And but that's not all of it. I tell you why my son, for instance, likes Berlin. So this is also about the style of my book. It's a mix of storytelling and history-telling, both, and a mix of that. My son and 2 of his friends recently moved into a cheap apartment on the top floor of a building in the Berlin-Neukölln district. Until recently, Neukölln, with the highest unemployment rate in Berlin, 17%, and its predominantly Muslim population, was considered a doomed neighborhood. But my son and his friends put their money on Neukölln because, in the meantime, young people from neighboring districts who had inadvertently found themselves at the center of the city after the fall of the wall. Do you understand this? Why they found themselves at the center suddenly? And could no longer afford the rents, had moved there and opened internet startups, fledgling galleries, even a few gourmet restaurants type vegan, not my cup of tea. The uncle of one of my son's friends gave them a 3-seater leather sofa for their new apartment. They were dead set on transporting the massive thing home that very day. But night had already fallen and the moving van rental places were all closed. So the 3 young men heaved the sofa out of the uncle's apartment and onto the street, carrying it 3 blocks on their heads to the nearest S-Bahn station. S-Bahn station, city train. On the way, they paused by a fountain on a square, plopped down onto the sofa, returned the greetings of passers-by, and indulged in a few swigs of schnapps from the bottle they had brought along. Nobody stopped them when they carried the sofa up the stairs to the tracks of the turnstile-free S-Bahn station. When the train arrived and the automatic door opened, they shoved the couch into the car. Miraculously, it fit perfectly. The 3 young men sat down in their comfortable seats to enjoy the ride. Several passengers laughed, others offered to trade places with them. Finally, the entire car broke out into applause. Das ist Berlin. That's Berlin, one of them shouted, and everyone followed suit. Das ist Berlin resounded throughout the car. The hardest part of the operation came after the S-Bahn ride. The 3 friends had to carry the couch several blocks and up 5 flights of stairs to their apartment. They succeeded because they had to succeed. They almost broke down trying to navigate the mammoth sofa past the narrow landings, but they never once doubted that their endeavor would end in triumph. When they finally made it to the top, they set the behemoths down in their apartment, helped themselves to their well-stocked liquor cabinet, and toasted first to themselves, then to Berlin, before falling asleep on the couch. So this is just one of the stories that cannot easily happen in any other city. Could it happen in New York? No. I came by the subway here. No, it couldn't happen here. Now, I touch many buttons of Berlin. I was very interested in the new architecture of Berlin and all the fights about architecture. In Berlin, more interesting than the architecture are the debates about architecture. And so I followed these debates, and you might, read about them in my book. I have also dealt with the clubs. My kids are, of course, adult now. They said, Papa, for which age group are you going to write? And I said, you know me, I'm not writing for any age group. I write for the whole world. They said, but if you don't write about the clubs, if you don't write for the 16, 20, 30-year-old, we will not read the book. And so I was asking her, what's the matter with the clubs? And so, how do I get in, by the way? In my and I could convince a very young girlfriend to go with me, but that was, of course, not enough. And anyway, I made it into the clubs, but I will just give you a little impression about that. Without the clubs, there wouldn't be any interest in Berlin right now for young people. So where are the clubs here? The most known, he's actually way more known than me, for instance, or any other writer, is the bouncer who stands in front of the club Berghain. Berghain was labeled some years ago by the New York Times as the best club in the world. They have lost this title, but they are now on place 7 or 8, I don't know. And I just, why is the bouncer so important? Because he decides whether you get in or not. And you don't know what his criteria are. He just looks at you and then nods or makes like this. And then you go peacefully, please, without any protest, and you can get in. So I will read a little bit of that. Berghain is an offshoot of the techno club Ostgut, which closed in 2003. Its operators, Norman Thormann and Michael Teufele, good name for a club owner, had succeeded in acquiring a former heat and power plant on the grounds of the old Eastern Ostbahnhof station and refurbished it for their purposes. The neoclassic style industrial building from the early years of the German Democratic Republic appealed to them. The fact that not everyone can get into the club adds to Berghain's mythical status. Since I'm no longer of suitable clubbing age and was worried I would be turned away, I had myself put on the manager's guest list. But even so, my companion and I decided to get on the line outside the entrance, which was still short of midnight. We wanted to get an idea of Berghain's clientele and the bouncer's selection criteria. It seemed like almost everyone trying to get in had read the comments online and followed the advice to avoid flashy and eccentric outfits. There they stood all in a row, well-behaved and inconspicuous, most of the men in sneakers, jeans, and T-shirts, the women a bit more colorful, but only a few in dresses or miniskirts, and not a single pair of stilettos anywhere in sight. Some men, in anticipation of hours or days of dancing, had even showed up already in their undershirts. They spoke every imaginable language, but a certain uniformity about the crowd was apparent. Even so, everyone was between 20 and 30 years old, in good spirits and easygoing, a friendly, pleasant crowd looking for a good time, not for trouble. The bouncers already attracted attention, even from a distance. There were 3 of them, and each one apparently had a different function. So what exactly this was wasn't entirely clear to the patrons. The arbiter who granted or refused admission, on the other hand, commanded respect and was impossible to miss. Sven Marquardt, not a sax so much as a post-punk rocker with a belly, busty beard, and gray hair in ponytail, my favorite haircut, by the way. The steel lip piercings, heavy earrings, and hefty iron chain around his neck lent him a certain sense of unpredictability. He stood in front of the entrance like a statue, hardly moving at all. Every time 2 or 3 patrons were let in, a torturous pause followed. The entrance overlord would size up the next pair, absorb the data, their clothing, expressions, and body language transmitted to him, and organize his input, comparing and evaluating it according to criteria he alone was privy of. With an imperceptible signal, he communicated his decision to his helpers. Was it a sign of his hand or head or a blink of his eyes that meant either yes or no? There are countless stories and rumors about Sven Marquardt on the Berlin scene. But I cut this paragraph here. The couple right in front of us was turned away of the door and toddled off to the side without protest. Marquardt politely wished them a good night as they left. Obviously, we wondered what it was about their outfits, glances, appearance that had tipped the scale so cruelly against them. After all, we told ourselves the two of them must have done something wrong to fail the test. Unfortunately, we hadn't seen them from the front. From my perspective, I had only noticed a certain bagginess about their T-shirts and something matted about the man's hair. Slightly taken aback, I interrupted my train of thought. In trying to figure out the bouncer's criteria, I was already identifying with the selection process. Weren't the two of us, my companion in her little red leather jacket and I in my black linen suite, just as suspicious? Especially considering I was a good 30 years older than the average patron, even in the eyes of a generous judge. Nonsense, I told myself. The truth is there aren't even any criteria. It's all just about the ritual of granting or refusing admission. And the more arbitrary it is, the better it works. Sven Marquardt has often been asked about his selection criteria and in interviews. Obviously, he has been smart enough to refuse categorically to answer the question. The closest thing to the truth is probably that these criteria are a mystery even to him. It may be that his practiced eye can pick out potential thugs and troublemakers, but the main point of the procedure is probably just to create a barrier that separates the inner temple of Berghain from the outside world. Visitors must pass a test before being granted admission to the mysterious, dark cement mountain, a test for which they cannot prepare. That's all it takes for this place. A composite of the names of two Berlin neighborhoods, Kreuzberg and Friedrichshain, Berghain, to assume a mythical quality. Anyone standing at the threshold of Berghain can't help but think of Kafka's castle, to which poor Kay was denied access, also entirely without justification, as it happens. By the way, when I then went out from Berghain in the morning, bright sunshine in Berlin, and the bouncer was still there, Sven Marquardt, and I told him, I'm writing a book on Berlin, I would like to do an interview with you. And he said calmly, here is the card of my agent, you have to talk to him. So, where are we now? Well, I think we don't have the time to give you more. Actually, I wanted to read you a little piece about the history of East Berlin beards. The bushy beards of East Berlin men that have not survived the evolutionary process in the last 25 years. But I think we'll leave that to talks, and I think I introduce Professor Baer. So you have a lot of other chapters. This is just a very short selection of what I did here. Many stories, many reflections. I'm also dealing with the dark sides of Berlin, with Muslim parallel societies, with a new barbarism, breakouts of youth violence. And I'm dealing with a totally surprising fact. There are 17 to 19,000 young Israelis living in Berlin right now. I didn't know that before I wrote the book. But almost nobody knows it. And I interviewed some of them, and it's just a quite, for my generation, a totally surprising story. They love Berlin. And not, at least, for the fact that there is no other city in Germany that really has taken on the past this strongly as the city of Berlin. Okay, I leave it here.
First of all, thank you. I want to commend you on a really beautifully written book, since I have to earn my keep here, so I thought I'd actually remind people that, you know, the great tradition of writers actually taking a city as a readable text starts with Baudelaire and what we consider modernity. So you're continuing to read Berlin, and I have I want to dive right in and ask you a very specific question. First of all, of course, you all know it's wrong that there are deep and refined criteria to get into Berghain. Since I've gotten in, there must be really reasons why people get in who are not on the guest list. So I was in once, exactly. And actually, I'll tell you the story. So I got in with my little sister, and I come from a very big family of very judgmental Berlin-raised people, all my siblings, namely. So I went with my little sister. I got in. I was, you know, all proud, feeling I went to Berghain. And a couple of days, I was a little younger, not much younger, too old still. So I go home and I tell my older sister, who's also raised in Berlin, said, we got into Berghain. She said, how did you get in? What did you do? When did you go? What time was it? And I said, well, if you have to ask, obviously, you don't know. But that's my internal family, which is a very Berlin comment, actually. People would not even tell you the answers. I want to ask you something very specific. You do a lot of really great work, I think, talking about how the city has grown together in the last 25 years, East and West Berlin, which for people who grew up in West Berlin is a very complicated thing. It was alluded to that in the beginning, in your earlier work, you had already kind of figured out that people have a wall in their heads, and it takes a long time to overcome that. The other thing that had to be absorbed by West Berlin, which was feeling quite comfortable, I think, being in this bizarre insulation chamber, which was a bit of a hothouse, and also, I think, dying in a certain way culturally, because there was just not a visible future for some people. The other thing we as West Berliners had to absorb was the government. And that decision, if people remember, was actually not a clear-cut decision, that the government was going to move from this wonderful, incredible place called Bonn to this backwater near Poland called Berlin. And if you think about this today, it would mean moving Parliament, Senate, and the White House to New York City. It would mean moving the Knesset to Tel Aviv, or it would mean moving the Great Hall of the People to Shanghai. Tel Aviv, Shanghai, New York, the big cultural capitals of those countries, but not the political capitals. It's very unusual for countries, actually. So when Berlin absorbed these amazingly creative, inspiring, and wildly, you know, off-the-books kind of people who run our government, what do you think that did to the spirit of Berlin? And why do you think actually what happened is that it became the vibrant city it is, rather than the kind of, you know, administrative desert that some, you know, government cities become?
Well, the amazing thing is that Berlin is just too big to be really affected by the presence of so many politicians. Berlin has swallowed these politicians, and we rather don't take notice of them. Angela Merkel, for instance, she has chosen to go into my favorite Italian restaurant. As I said, this is the time where I have to find another restaurant for myself. But it's not true. It is amazing how modest this all goes on, you know. You see Angela Merkel at the window, always at the same place. She is focused on 2 or 3 friends or partners she's talking to. She never looks up because she doesn't want to respond to the greetings. But there is no black car in front of the restaurant. You don't see the security. No guest will turn his head, obviously, to say, here's Angela Merkel. So it's all a very discreet thing, and I said, well, in my young years, I would have said, this is a picture of a civilized government. And actually, I mean, this is how Berlin deals with that. Angela Merkel goes in the supermarket in order to buy things. She cooks from time to time for her husband. Berlin has never cared about prominence. Sometimes if you see a prominent guest from Munich or Hamburg, and they are used that people turn their heads if they show up, you know, in front of Paris Bar, for instance, in Berlin, you know. I have seen these prominents, of course you know them, but you don't care. You just never turn your head, you just pass by, and that's how Berlin is. So prominent people who are used to get heads turned on them, they are frustrated if they visit Berlin.
I want to ask something else about the way issues are negotiated in Berlin that are of concern to people way beyond that geographic space. So if we can talk a little bit, and I actually am doing this on purpose, I'm not going to tell you everything that's in the book because you should really buy the book. It's a beautiful book, it's a very insightful book, it's a very incisive book, and it's very interesting how you're actually able to diagnose the moment, the now, both in its historical depth and what it means for the future of that city. I want to talk specifically about the past summer where the street demonstrations in Berlin have dealt with issues that are not specifically German or in Berlin. It's Israel and Palestine, it's Ukraine and Russia. And in some ways giving the history of the place, giving, you know, the tremendous catastrophes that were designed, implemented, carried out by Germans in the name of Germans, in the name of Germany. How do you see these today? And we talked really briefly about Angela Merkel as a figurehead for a different new kind of Germany that is not unrelated. If this were taking place in Munich, it would mean something else, right? Mm-hmm. So what Berlin contributes to this kind of public, very difficult conversation? Or
the interesting thing about Berlin is I've done another book about Jews who were hidden during the Nazi years in Berlin. And it's not a great number. It's 1,500 Jews have been hidden. But if you know the stories, if you know the organizations who did, these were friends mostly, not organizations, you come up with at least 15, 20 friends for just one hidden Jew because they couldn't stand just all the time with the same friend and so forth. This happened in no other city in Germany. And as a matter of fact, the Nazis culturally never were able to really take possession of Berlin. They were able to do that in Munich, but not in Berlin. And you feel some of this to the very day. I mean that now Angela Merkel was in the forefront of protesting against this new anti-Semitism that is rising up in Germany, but we have to be very precise about it. This new anti-Semitism is actually is animated by young Arabs and Palestinians, and of course they try to interconnect with the old anti-Semites, the neo-Nazis, and there is an interconnection there. But there are two different phenomena. We have to keep them distinguished. Just recently, a professor for the Institute of Anti-Semitism, you know him probably, he said, well, we have a stable value about the classic anti-Semitism in Germany, it's about 20%. but it's not anymore a deadly, annihilating anti-Semitism as you now see it with this new anti-Semitism, and it's mixing. So this is a new phenomenon we have to deal with it because these kids, these young Arabs and Palestinians, they live with us. So it's our problem. We have to deal with it. But I don't know yet how we come out of this because, as I have pointed out in many other articles that I have written even before the book, there is a kind of parallel society, a parallel Muslim society in Berlin, and it's where it can survive this kind of new anti-Semitism.
To push it a little
so
bit.
New as we think.
I mean, this kind of, what you call this kind of overlap or alliance between an old kind of anti-Semitism and a new kind of anti-Semitism, there's probably overlaps on both groups. And then these young Arabs and Palestinians are also Germans. So what's complicated that they share, that there are multiple identities today and they're not actually clear-cut. So if Berlin is an incredibly popular place, you're saying, you tell people you're from Berlin, their eyes light up, oh, how cool. And I always think, look, I can't take credit for that, really. I didn't make that, but people sort of compliment you practically and want to hear something. And it doesn't have iconic architecture, it's not beautiful. It has a certain charm because it has a lot of space compared to other cities, and there's different things you pointed in the book. At the same time, the image of Germany, while Berlin, I think, helps that image and improves. People come, people want to be there, young people, creative people, et cetera. People want to go have fun also. Started with a love parade, et cetera, those kinds of exercises. But there are other parts of Europe that don't really think Europe should be governed from Berlin, and no one elected Angela Merkel to be the Empress of Europe, financially or otherwise. So I actually think, is there a tension that people actually come to Berlin, really enjoy it, really think it's a great place to be, but we are trying to reconcile its status politically and economically in the world, which is not so different from people coming to New York City, who don't all love and embrace the United States and its policies.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I go outside of Germany, I have this a little painful feeling that the Germans are the only ones who believe in the virtues of austerity policy. And it's amazing. It is just not discussed in Germany. It is just not discussed. We have this finance minister, Schäuble, very efficient minister, and he just turns it down and he gives not in a millimeter. But as soon as I'm in America, I read all these Nobel Prize-winning comments in the New York Times and in other papers of Stieglitz and Krugman and all these people, and they say, it's great what the Germans do. And actually, it seems, when I'm here, it seems crazy to me. But when I'm back in Germany, it doesn't seem so crazy. I'm not an expert on this. Maybe I'm not intelligent enough. I don't really know who is right, but I'm suspicious that the Germans are not right, and so I must get firmer on that in order to convince my compatriots about that we are on the wrong path. Actually, it seems that this austerity policy is only good for Germany and for nobody else in Europe. Maybe for the northern states, and we are risking the breaking away of Europe. I think this whole problem with the euro is not finished, and if France goes down, as it seems, this is just too much, too big a country to be saved by Europe.
I mean, you raise a different topic in the book that the Germans who grew up with a division of the country in the West absorbed a kind of implicit or explicit lesson that this was punishment for the crimes committed during World War II. A different lesson probably imparted in East Berlin, and actually in East Germany. I think it would be interesting because people in the room here, some grew up in West Germany, some grew up in East Germany. So this was an understanding that there was a kind of tax exacted on a people. But today, what kind of historical role does Germany, and I'm not asking for political or economic analysis, but how do people who are traveling the world, like you Germans who are saying Berlin is a great place, come visit, and there's still a lot of people who've lived through times when obviously this wasn't a rightful place in history to have that kind of prominence again and to have this kind of, and I think there was, in your own work, there was a lot of skepticism in the beginning whether things would grow together that quickly. You were convinced in a way, you were convinced when you saw them looking at the oranges. These people are not going to settle for anything less, but that's the other side. And they were built in West Germany, you point that out, there was a demonstration to keep the wall. So whether the people in West Germany were very cautious, think, is this too fast, is this too much, is this going to be an overconfident nation that doesn't deserve to have that kind of pride?
I think this was a great gift of the history. And by the way, just by writing about it in my book and researching it, I came to a conclusion that I didn't come to in earlier times. If the Americans and the Brits, if they wouldn't have insisted to keep a foot in Berlin, you know how that worked, because the Americans had already conquered parts of Saxony and Thuringia, and they decided to leave that to the Russians in order to have a foot in Berlin. If they wouldn't have done this, the German question, as it was called, would have never remained open. Berlin would have become the capital of East Germany and under Russian dominance, and there wouldn't have never been any unification. This was a strategic decision of some politicians who were, yeah, maybe more intelligent than the ones we have in this position. It was a great decision. No, I think, you know, I don't talk about merits, but I talk about that history is kind of history in a certain way is forgetful. I would have never thought that so many Israelis would feel fine in Berlin. They would even use Berlin as a kind of restroom from the stress in their home country. Of course they want to go back, but they are not bothered by the critiques that ministers in Israel are directing towards them. Meanwhile, I've talked to quite a few of them. And that Germany has this chance to unify, to become this place that is wanted all over the place and all over the world, and that Berlin is actually a very modest, a decent city that is not arrogant anymore. It has become a friendly city. For me, an unthinkable thing. You know, I remember when I came to Berlin, I came from South Germany, and everything is nice and polite and slow, very slow in South Germany. And when I would ask for a street in the 60s, a Berliner would say, "Don't you have eyes in your head? There's a sign, just look." And this was the normal approach, you know. In Germany, somebody would even accompany me to the street I was looking for in South Germany, in Berlin. And now many Americans, many French people are telling me, "My God, how friendly the Berliners are." And I don't understand. I say, my God, maybe there are two Peter Schneiders. The Peter Schneider who has lived before the wall came down, and the Peter Schneider who hasn't gotten quite everything that has happened after the wall came down. There are two personalities. I've actually known two different cities. And yeah.
Maybe we should open it up if people have questions. Do you want to start? Do you have a question? Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
The vote to move the capital in the Bundestag from Bonn to Berlin was quite close. When you look back, do you think moving the capital to Berlin, some, 50 kilometers or so from the Polish border, has that made Germany a less Western-oriented country? I know there's a debate going on about what is the special relationship with Russia, but do you think this has had an impact, that there has been the center of gravity of German culture is no longer Western, but is more middle European?
Could be the case, at least as long you think about the politicians who were so happy in Bonn. People like Konrad Adenauer himself, who actually he didn't like Berlin. He didn't even come to Berlin when the wall was erected. And he was a politician from the Rhine, and he thought, you know, on the other side of Elbe, this is no man's land. We don't want to touch this. This is, you better don't go there. But of course, this has changed, and that's for sure. Since Germany has lost the, you know, the Ostgebiete after the war, Berlin is now just 100 kilometers west from the Polish border, and the country seems to be unbalanced geographically. And you think also about this unbalance if you just see how Germans treat this threat from Putin and the Ukrainian crisis, because there are many people in, not only in Berlin, in Germany, who think that we need to understand Putin. We haven't given enough thought about how much the poor Soviet Union has lost after the Soviet Union has been dissolved. And so there is a lot of tears and pity about poor Putin. I don't feel that way in the least. I think he's a terrible KGB guy, and he will go as far as we let him go. And as nicer we are with him, as more terrible he gets. But there is a split between the Germans about judging about that, and there are the geopoliticians, very strong in the Social Democratic Party, who say we have to understand that Ukraine has actually been part of Russia, they have lost so much, and we should have never intervened there, should have never offered them anything in order not to provoke them. But whether this has to do with the geographical situation, I doubt it. This is a German condition.
It's the only thing maybe that people in Berlin still lived through the war in a different way from people in Bonn maybe, and being close to Poland, which really suffered tremendously in the war, that the actual memory of people still alive, because you mentioned people in the book who had lived through that may or may not shape someone's thinking. Whether it's 100 miles, what do we know what's 100 miles west of here, you know? But if people in the city have lived through war, I think a kind of hesitation isn't only what role can Germany play, but Germany has actually lived through war, and people are still alive. So that generational shift may be more important than the geographic one was, that people who will no longer govern or be making decisions.
Did you write it in German, the book, or in English, or in both?
By the way, that you could even think it was written in English.
Translator, yeah, right here.
This is due to a terrific translator. I think for many books I haven't been so happy with this translator. She's called Sophie Schlöndorff, and this is her first, she's a professional translator, but she did mostly industrial text, and this is the first time she is translating a book like that, and I think it will not be the last time she has done such a good work. It never happened to me while I was reading in my accented German, as you have heard. I was almost every time I was asked, who translated this so brilliantly? And yeah, I just can say Sophie Schlöndorff. I thank you to her.
What is the title in German?
We don't know yet. We have a title which is called An der Schönheit kann's nicht liegen. Because, you know, in the very first lines, I'm asking, so why is it that everyone wants to go to Berlin? Why is that?
It means it's not because she's pretty.
Schönheit kann's nicht liegen. Then I go on. The whole book is trying to answer this question. Why is everyone, you know, yeah, wants to go to Berlin.
Do you want to ask your question?
I ask my question as a native New Yorker and a Berlinophile, and it's a question about gentrification. I don't know if you address that in the book,
course,
but
yeah.
Berlin is changing so fast. Neighborhoods like Prenzlauer Berg and even Neukölln, and of course the Mitte.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, excuse my terrible German, but of the ruined structure that used to be artist studios, Tacheles, I think it was called.
Tacheles.
Tacheles, okay.
Yeah.
Which is now closed. Last time I was there, it's just
And I think it was
padlocked.
bought by an Arab sheikh.
That's right, a developer. And so my question is, what's the future of Berlin for young people and artists? Still a lot of space, but changing so quickly.
This is a very important question, and actually it's the same question for any attractive city in this world. And I think, by the way, that Berlin in some parts has dealt better than with that question than New York or London or Paris. Because the problem is, most of these neighborhoods that we love so much and people from foreign countries love so much, they were actually made by young creative people without money. How does a city deal with that problem? And you mentioned gentrification. This is actually an expression that the autonomists have stolen from the British historians, because gentrification was an expression to name the process, exactly that process, that rich people bought into poor neighborhoods and made them up and, you know, and renovated them, and the poor people didn't have where to go anymore. Gentrification was the name. Now, our gentrification activists, they were terrible. They have, in the beginning, they were put to fire so-called luxury cars. My own car, Saab, Cabriolet, could be a target for them. And they have, destroyed so-called luxury cafes. This has died down, but the problem remains. Now we have a mayor in Pankow, and he came up, of course, he belongs to the former Communist Party. Now they are still active. They call themselves differently now. They call themselves the left. Before they were called Party PDS, and it was translated by my friends, praktisch dasselbe, PDS. Praktisch dasselbe. Now, this mayor, for instance, he came forward with the following, with the following proposal. He said, in certain streets, in certain districts, we have to prevent luxury renovation. So you're not allowed to have 2 bathrooms, but just 1. You're not allowed to have a certain kind of parquet, which is very so. Well, it is, of course, it reminds very much at the former GDR. This is not the way to solve things, but I'm still waiting. What the proposals are of big cities, how to deal with this is a real problem. And just one, you can read that in my book. A very positive example was done by a famous club named Bar 25, Bar 25. And they had actually, they had made their club on an area between Ostbahnhof and Holzmarkt station. And it was a very exposed area. It was actually then became very valuable for the city. And they made so much trouble and demonstrations, and they had so many friends all over the world, even mayors and governments were intervening because they all go to this club. So at the end, the mayor of Berlin, this was Wowereit, said, okay, this is part of Berlin culture, and we don't give that piece of land, that's real estate, to the highest bidder. We give it to a certain price to you, but you have to pay a price, but not the highest price. And that is a kind of new principle. And this in a city which has 70 billion debt, 70 billion euro debt. This is quite something.
I was wondering about the cultural shift that was alluded to. I mean, part of West Berlin was in part this artificial culture, and in part it was the East German culture, because all the East German, not all, but most East German writers and so on, and theater people and so on had moved to West Berlin.
Yeah.
So it was already a unified cultural center. But now I have the impression that there's so many people from outside coming in that there's something altogether totally different
That's right.
growing.
That's right.
And that's not Middle Europe either.
No. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Prenzlauer Berg, which was the Bohemian district of former East Berlin, Prenzlauer Berg has now an exchange of the population of 80%. Only 20% of the people who lived there 20 years ago are still living there. And who are the others? It's very interesting. Brits, Americans, Poles, no Turk among them. This is because Turks, traditionally ended up in West Berlin. But to the very day, they don't end up in East Berlin. It's still kind of an unknown country to them. And Prenzlauer Berg is difficult to pronounce. But Pfarrer Thierse, this guy with this enormous beard, I wanted to read the history of his beard is very interesting. But anyway, he told me that that Americans and Arabs, they were able to pronounce Prenzlauer Berg as the only German word they ever have heard about, because they were investing there.
You addressed, interestingly enough, Angela Merkel, but not the left. And we have an interesting phenomenon, correct me if I'm wrong. We have a majority in parliament of Social Democrats, left and Green Party. Now, the Social Democrat Party cannot with the left party because they are old communists, but they could have majority. Is it possible that Sigmar Gabriel, a year before the end of the term, switch sides, becomes chancellor, and then gets with the chancellor bonus into the next general election?
You seem to be sure of many things I'm not so sure of. But let me say this. If you name Gabriel somebody from the left, many people in Germany would contradict you, He's all for TTIP, Gabriel. He's all for TTIP, and most of the Social Democrats are not. No, but I think he's a very able and powerful politician. I really have respect for him. He's a very good speaker. He's very decided. He has a problem that Merkel has created. Merkel has behaved in such a way. She has taken every viable plant out of the garden of the SPD and has said, this is CDU. To the point that even me, that has always, somebody who has always voted for the Social Democrats, I don't know why I should keep on doing this. I could also vote for Angela Merkel. And Gabriel, of course, does not really know how to answer this, because really Merkel has taken away many votes from the SPD. But now she's paying a price. If the Alternative für Deutschland, they might get back the conservative part of the CDU that has no home anymore in the CDU of today. And then Merkel has a real problem. The whole balance of power as it is now could change in Germany.
If I can ask you to read one more passage, which I really loved, and I thought it would be a good ending, and then we'll end, and then you can drink wine and buy the book, buy 2 books, have Peter Schneider sign your book. But maybe this one right here, I really loved this passage. Downstairs, it's Kühlhaus.
Oh, why don't you read it?
No. All right, so you will have to listen. You have never heard this before. Okay, so downstairs. So he's talking about Kühlhaus, which was this kind of gallery, artsy space, like Tacheles, I guess. Downstairs, back outside, there it was again suddenly. The city I remembered. Across from the Kühlhaus, the glaring neon sign of a new hotel called the Mercure cut through the darkness. Its western face was a windowless firewall, every inch of which had been covered with spray paint. Themes typical of the mural graffiti of the 1980s were visible. A bare-breasted nature girl in the depth of a jungle with a big city skyline in the background, and reigning over it all, a massive likeness of Karl Marx. A seedy parking lot spread out at the base of the firewall, bordered at its other end by another firewall. On the elevated tracks to the left, an S-Bahn glided by. In the narrowly defined triangle above me, between the elevated railway, Mercure Hotel, and Kühlhaus, I could make out two infinitely distant pale stars in the January night sky. It had always seemed to me that the stars over Berlin were billions of miles further away than above any other city, and never more so than in January. Thank you.